today, this evening. Thank you in particular to Professor Naila Kabeer for agreeing to be a part of the inaugural session of North-South University School of Humanities and Social Sciences Distinguished Webinar Series. The seminar series has started earlier this year, well, late last year, but this is the first webinar of the series, and we're very, very excited to have you as our first distinguished speaker. Thank you so much for the time and the willingness to be a part of this conversation with her. My name is Nazia. I am currently an assistant professor and the chair of the Department of English and Modern Languages. I was very privileged and pleased to have known about Dr. Kabeer's book when we ran a review of the book at the Daily Star book section. And if I may talk numbers a little, it did really well. There was a lot of response from our readers in terms of how much time they engaged with the article, because as you can imagine, given the title of the book and given the title of today's talk, there's a lot of interest in the subject matter. Today's talk is titled Renegotiating Patriarchy, Gender Agency and the Bangladeshi Paradox. I am delighted to have with us our Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Muhammad Rizwanul Islam, who is a professor of law. I'd like to ask Dr. Islam to share a few words as part of an introductory remark, and then we will introduce Dr. Kabeer with us formally. Dr. Islam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Manzoor. First of all, on behalf of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, it is my utmost pleasure to welcome you all. And I'm very thankful to our esteemed speaker, Professor Naila Kabeer. And I have not been able to read the entire book, but the parts that I have been able to read, it has been a pleasure. If I may say a few words about the book, in a way, as the title indicates, that it depicts a story of paradox. If we talk about our economy, perhaps we all know that our economy hasn't progressed substantially in the last 5 decades or so. If we talk about our governance, I think it would be fair to say that if not outright bad, it has been underwhelming. But somehow there are progresses on certain fronts, particularly on some societal fronts. Patriarchy has been challenged. And in my understanding, Professor Kabeer has taken a very different approach. She has presented stories from below. She has presented the stories of common folks, that how through their actions, through their concerted actions, they have made some positive changes. To my limited understanding, in a way, it is an ethnographic research, but I would say the approach that she has taken is truly interdisciplinary and pluralistic. And that, I think, makes it particularly fitting for the inaugural session of our series, because this is about the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, not about any particular discipline within the school. There is no way that I can do justice to such an excellent work in so few words. I'm sure Professor Kabeer will present her work in a very thorough way, in a meticulous way. I look forward to learning from her talk and also from the questions from our esteemed audience. Before I finish, let me formally thank my esteemed colleague, Professor Manzoor, for her effort in organizing this, and also the TAs from the Department of English and Modern Languages for their work in helping us organizing this session. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. To everybody else who's trickling in, thank you so much for joining. I would like to read out a brief bio of our esteemed speaker today, and after that, Professor Kabeer will be speaking to us. Naila Kabeer, Fellow of the Academy of Social Science, is Professor Emerita at the Department of International Development, as well as on the faculty of the International Inequalities Institute, London School of Economics, UK. She's also Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Sussex. She has a long track record of research, teaching, and advisory work within the field of international development, with a special focus on South Asia. She's an associate editor of Feminist Economics and on the editorial board of Development and Change, Gender and Development, and the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. She's also on the governing body of the United Nations Research in Social Development, the United Nations University, International Institute of Global Health, and part of the UN Women's Leadership Circle. She has published extensively in journals, books, and policy publications. Her first book, Reversed Realities, Gender Hierarchies in Development Thought, Verso, came out in 1994. Her latest book, Renegotiating Patriarchy, Gender, Agency, and the Bangladeshi Paradox, LSE Press, came out in September 2024, and is the book that brings us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Naila Kabeer.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the school for inviting me, and for Nazia for chasing me down, and for doing that very thoughtful book review in the Daily Star. It's always a pleasure when you realize someone has read your book and taken the trouble to reflect on it, and that came out very clearly in that review. So let me go to my topic, and could I ask you to share the PowerPoint that I sent you? Okay, thank you. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Can I manipulate this? Yes. No. I'd like to be able to move myself. Could you move to the next slide, please?
Would it be possible for Dr. Kabeer to share the slide herself?
Let me
see a share button?
I don't know if I have it.
It's okay. I will do it for you. Just tell me when to move to the next slide, and I will do it for you.
Okay. Could you move to the next slide?
Yes. Doing it right now. Where are you? Where are my screen share button? Here you go. Share. Okay, next.
Okay. So let's start with the idea and with the concept in the title, a paradox. So looking up and this is a word that's used a lot about what I'm describing in Bangladesh. And one of the definitions which I found useful is paradox is a person or a thing that conflicts with preconceived notions of what is reasonable or possible. It's contrary to accepted opinion. So what is described as the Bangladesh paradox is the very unexpected, contrary to received opinion, the unexpected pace of social progress in a challenging environment. So why was it unexpected? Next slide, please. Well, there are different elements to why the change in Bangladesh was regarded as paradoxical. There's an economic dimension. There's a widespread belief in the economics literature that you have to have achieved a certain rate of growth before you can afford to start investing in social progress, that you need to have some kind of a surplus. And this is what Amartya Sen calls the growth-led pathway to social progress. Now, Bangladesh has had a long history of exploitation by rulers foreign to the region, from the early Buddhist and Hindu monarchies, the Mughals, the British, and then 25 years as quasi-colony of Pakistan. And I have a little note there. When I was reading up about the history of Bangladesh, I thought this is very interesting that these people came from, all over from the West, but also a lot of migrants came from the East. And I looked at my DNA. I did a test of my DNA, and I find out that 48% of my DNA as a Bangladeshi is South Asia, which means they don't have ancient DNA to compare it to, so they don't know. But 16.8% is Pashtun, 14% is Sindhi, 4% is Borosho, 11% is East Asia, 4% is China, and 2% is Japan and Korea. So you can imagine that we in the Delta are the product of many, many different flows of migration coming from the West and from the East. However, we have been ruled almost from very early times with the Aryan invasion by rulers external to this region. And each successive regime has left us poorer. And so if we look at the Pakistan regime, income disparities between East and West Pakistan went from just 22% in 1950, it went as high as 61% in 1970. Most of the current country's budget, Pakistan's budget and foreign aid, went to West Pakistan, while most of the foreign exchange was earned by Bangladesh. In the post-independence years after 71, it was about the second poorest country in the world. It had some of the world's highest fertility rates, invoking fears of Malthusian catastrophe, as population growth inevitably outpaced the rate of economic growth. So one bit of the paradox is, here is a very poor country, okay? The second one, could we move to the next slide, is the political dimensions of the Bangladesh paradox. And that is, there is a belief that even if you're very, very poor, if you have a very strong and caring state, they may be able to compensate for your poverty. So, you know, people like Sen, etc., talked about the policy-mediated pathway to social progress and how Kerala, Sri Lanka, Cuba, countries that were quite poor, still did very well on social development. And yet, Bangladesh has always been characterized by very poor quality governance. As the last few years have shown us, it has really reached the pits. And that's regardless of military rule or civilian rule. It's regardless of dictatorship of democracy, and regardless of which party is in power. It is consistently ranked amongst the bottom 20% of the world in terms of governance and effectiveness of institutions. So it was not a policy-mediated pathway per se. The third element of the paradox is that, if we move to the next slide, is that what I call the cultural dimensions. Bangladesh has been described as having one of the most non-negotiable patriarchies in the world. It is part of a belt of classic patriarchy that stretches from North Africa, across the Middle East, northern plains of India, but also includes East Asia, China, Taiwan, etc. These are regions that are characterized by patrilineal descent. You inherit and you trace your descent through the male line, patrilocal marriage, parda or female seclusion, and very strong son preference. So as a result, the regions of classic patriarchy were characterized, unlike the rest of the world, by many more men in the population than women, what Amartya Sen calls the phenomenon of missing women. While Islam is often singled out as being particularly hostile to women, we should note that this region included other religions and belief systems, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism. However, although Bangladesh has been a Muslim majority country, the social progress that we're talking about, and that includes progress on gender equality, began and gained momentum at a time when a very orthodox version of Islam was being imported into the country through Middle Eastern aid and influence, and through the flows of migration between Bangladesh and the Middle East. So there was nothing about the patriarchal structure of Bangladesh that led you to believe that it would make these gains. Next slide, please. So in spite of these very unprepossessing circumstances that surrounded Bangladesh in its post-liberation years, it has made remarkable progress. So if we compare India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, who used to be one country, and look at the data between 1990 and 2011, we find that Bangladesh was poorer through much of this period. Its per capita GDP was much lower. Its social indicators were also much lower, but at some point, this started to change. Fertility rates declined across the three countries, but to a much greater extent in Bangladesh. So it was 2.2 fertility rates in Bangladesh, 2.6 in India, 3.4 in Pakistan. Education levels started to rise, but girls' education also started to rise. So that the ratio of girls to boys in school was 0.93 for Bangladesh, 0.72 for India, and 0.64 for Pakistan. Life expectancy started to rise for all three countries, but it had risen to much higher levels in Bangladesh than the other two countries. And in all these countries, male life expectancy had been higher because we said that missing women, but by the end of the period, female life expectancy, as in the rest of the world, was far higher in all three countries than male, but it was considerably higher in Bangladesh. And I've given statistics. So female life expectancy was 70 to male 68. In India, 67 to 64. In Pakistan, 66 to 64. Infant mortality rates declined in all three countries, but it fell furthest in Bangladesh. Now, the picture in all of these countries, we are seeing progress, but much more rapid progress in Bangladesh, despite it being a poorer country and lower per capita rates of growth. The picture started to diverge when it comes to child mortality. In India, gender disparities in child mortality remained high. It has been amongst the highest in the world, with severe female deficit in the under 5 age group. And also in India, we saw the new practice of female selective abortion, what has been called death before birth, so that sex ratios at birth in India rose from the worldwide norm of 105 boys born to every 100 girls to 111 boys to every 100 girls, as parents started to try to reconcile their very continued strong son preference with lower fertility rates. They wanted fewer children, but they wanted to make sure that those children were boys. There was some rise in sex ratios in Pakistan at birth, but not as drastic. In Bangladesh, however, where we've had very good demographic data since the 1960s because of the ICDDRB, sex ratios at birth remained at the international norm of 105 boys to 100 girls. There is some variation in Bangladesh, but where we do find slightly abnormal sex ratios, it is due to the stopping rule rather than sex-selective abortion. So what we have is a story. Yes, Bangladesh began to grow in the late 1990s. Poverty started to come down, but these social indicators had started rising well before growth rates took off. And what is quite significant is that a great deal of this progress took place in what we call the care or the reproductive economy, fertility, mortality, health. And what is extremely interesting is that this progress was both pro-poor and gender equitable. In other words, it benefited poor households disproportionately, and it also led to a decline in gender disparities in some of these indicators. Next slide, please. So, as you might imagine, I was quite intrigued by how it happened in a country that was described as a non-negotiable patriarchy. It was making this change on gender and on social progress. Now, I had done field work in a village in Faridpur in 1979, the period when Bangladesh was the basket case of the world. And I found, yes, fertility rates were very high, as they were high across most of Bangladesh, average of 7 children, and very high levels of son preference, for reasons that we can understand. Sons were the earners, girls were kept at home. Sons were now bringing in dowry. Girls, you had to pay dowry. Sons looked after their parents in old age. Girls were married off and went and joined their in-laws. But when I started to see the data on the Bangladesh paradox, the social progress that was being reported, it seemed that there had been a decline in some of these older forms of discrimination, around mortality, around health, around education. And we weren't seeing the new kinds of discrimination that were emerging in India and in parts of East Asia, sex-selective abortion. And it seemed to be that there was a revaluation of daughters in what had been a culture of strong son preference. So I returned with a team of researchers to that same village in 2010. I found, yes, there had been a decline in fertility, as there had been in much of Bangladesh, but I also found a major decline in son preference. Now, depending on the kind of survey indicators you used, it seemed almost as though there was a daughter preference, but actually there wasn't. What there had been was a weakening of son preference, to the extent that many parents said they were perfectly happy to have only daughters. Yes, they might have liked a son, but if 2 daughters was what they have, they didn't want any more children, and 2 daughters was what they would keep. And I also heard in this village that women's agency seemed to be a part of the story of change, that somehow women in their capacity as mothers, daughters, sisters were behaving differently to an older generation of women. And so that is what I set out to explore. So the next slide, please. And so this is the book, Renegotiating Patriarchy. Could we have the next slide, please? And it has a link that you can, it's open access, you can download it for free. So next slide, please. So the theoretical approach, could we go back? Yes. The theoretical approach that I took was I found that a lot of the explanations, and there are many, of the Bangladesh paradox tended to be pitched at the level of macroeconomic policies. You know, donors, NGOs, government policies, and so on. But I was interested because you can have all the policies you want. If people on the ground do not respond to these policies and act on them, you're not going to get change unless you force people into change, and that wasn't happening. So I was interested in understanding how people on the ground, men and women, were interpreting the changes in the larger structures, in the macro structures, and how they interpreted them, how they acted on them. So my approach was about structure and agency mediated by practice. The book is called Renegotiating Patriarchy. It is not called Overthrowing Patriarchy, and there is a reason. The change in gender relations were led by women who wanted to challenge injustice in the existing patriarchal structure. They wanted more democratic relations within family, but they were not looking for confrontations that would lead to greater losses than gains. And of course, they varied in their willingness and their ability to renegotiate the terms of the patriarchal contract that they had inherited. So I placed them on a continuum of forms of agency, which reflected the extent to which they had internalized patriarchal norms and the extent to which they were questioning it. At one end of the continuum were those who seemed to have internalized the norms of patriarchal inequality. You know, Sen talks about adaptive preferences, that people adapt their expectations of life to what they think is possible. Abu Lagod talks about maybe we have different values in Bangladesh. Maybe we have different values among Muslim countries. Maybe they're not interested in liberation. Maybe what they're interested is in piety, in family, closeness, and so on. As she says, maybe there is an alternative pathway to personhood in Bangladesh, which requires women to abide by social norms. And then Denise Candioti talks about how, even though women might be subordinate in their youth, as they grow older and they become a mother-in-law, they get daughters-in-law, they acquire a certain position of power. So it is in their interest, to some extent, to aspire to that position of power by having a lot of sons and getting a daughter-in-law and so on. So that was people who complied with the norms. Then there was what James Scott calls the weapons of the weak. These are people who were questioning the norms, but were not willing to articulate them. So their resistance was of a covert kind. It might have been mocking people. It might have been hiding money. It might have been lying about what they earned. All kinds of deceptions, maneuvers, etc., which allowed them to get some of their way, but did not necessarily challenge the structures of authority within their families and societies. The third kind of agency was bargaining. And this is where women come out in the open and say, look, this is what I want to do. I want to go out and work, okay? I want to educate my daughter. I want to travel on my own. But I realize that in order to go against cultural norms, this might affect you as the authority figure, and so I will concede certain things to you. So it's called a yielding and wielding. So you got it very explicitly with the garment workers in Bangladesh. When their husbands objected to them working in the garment factory, they said, look, I know you're worried about the housework not getting done. So I'm going to wake up really early in the morning. I'm going to do all the housework. I'm going to go to work in the factory. I'm going to come back. I'm going to finish the housework. And the money I will earn will be for the family. It will be for our children. It will be for their education. So here we have, I concede something in order to gain something. Of course, it's at a price. These women are working very long hours. They're not having much control over their income, but they are achieving outcomes that they value. And the final form of agency was what I called open defiance. In other words, you saw this amongst wives who were fed up with abusive husbands and decided they were going to walk out. You saw this amongst daughters who felt that their parents had so favored their brothers that the sisters had lost out and who were no longer willing to abide by their duties to their parents. And you heard this a lot, in work from the 80s, 90s, daughters saying, my parents could have put aside money for my education. Instead, they used up all the money to send their son to the Middle East, and I owe them nothing. And of course, open defiance carries costs. You might lose the safety that you had, the security that you had. So what led to open defiance was new kinds of resources, for instance, jobs in factories, but also new forms of collective action. Collective action is not the great story of change in Bangladesh, even though a lot of feminists would like it to be. The great story of change in Bangladesh is about individual agency exercised in very subtle ways. But there are aspects of collective action through the NGOs, through trade unions, which also helped for open defiance to take place. Next slide, please. So this is the outline of the book, and I'm not going to go into it, but I'll give you a brief summary. My empirical approach, I think you said it earlier, is interdisciplinary. I began out in economics, in the mainstream economics department, and I found it an extremely unpersuasive account of the way human beings behave. So I moved slowly into sociology, anthropology, etc. But I retain an interest in economic phenomenon. Methodological pluralism, yes, it is very qualitative, but you will find that I have cited statistics, tables, regressions, and the back of the book I've confined all my tables because I don't want the tables to interrupt the flow. But I believe in numbers because I think that having statistics gives you a certain confidence that the claims that you are making can be representative rather than random. So it is methodologically pluralist. And I also, and the anthropology part of it, I drew on people's own interpretations alongside how others had interpreted their behavior. So the etic and the emic. So I find that a lot of the paradox element, particularly towards the beginning of the paradox, reflected the fact that many scholars never asked men and women their motivations. They inferred it from their behavior, but they didn't actually go and ask them, why do you have so many children? Or why have you stopped having children? And so I was very interested in how qualitative research of the kind I've done and others have done gave us a somewhat different perspective of the emic perspective. So the book actually takes history and geography very seriously. Because a lot of people say, is Bangladesh exceptional? It is only exceptional in that its history and its geography meant that it was isolated from the mainstream of North Indian culture for many hundreds of years. It is only in the time of the Mughals, when the rivers started to move eastward, that the Bengal Delta became navigable and that many more people start to come and try and cultivate the Bengal Delta, which up till that point had been forests, mangroves, and swamps. It did mean that we were ruled by other people, and we did have many different religious influences. And so the Islam that grew up in Bangladesh, the Islam that was adopted around the time of the Mughals or just before, was always rooted in the folk culture of Bangladesh. So it was an Islam that drew on the religions and belief systems around it. And for that reason, it is often described as a very syncretic and somewhat pluralist form of religious belief. 71 was disastrous. We came out of, 25 years of being a quasi-colony of Pakistan, several hundred years of British colonialism. We were one of the poorest countries in the world. And the policy debates that I discuss in one of the chapters were extremely depressing. We were the basket case of the world. We were called the test case for development. If development can happen in Bangladesh, it can happen anywhere, right? This is the test case. And we were caught in a low-level equilibrium trap of poverty. It looked like fertility rates were never going to go down. It looked like, the partition of land meant that farm sizes got smaller and smaller. There was no scope for agricultural productivity. And the the ground level research around the time was very much the same. It was very pessimistic. It was very ethic, and it sort of said that, what we've inherited from our history is a very individualistic culture. We have no stable communities. The land is always moving. People engage in violence to claim the land. The kind of collective sense of collectivity was missing. And it was around this time we started to see this data. Most importantly, the first place where progress showed was fertility. By the mid-80s, Bangladesh reported one of the most rapid fertility declines in demographic history. Here's a country that is being held up as an example of Malthusian future. And yet, fertility decline went from 7, 8, 9 children to 2-point-something children. And then we started seeing other changes. Infant mortality, child mortality was very high, one of the reasons that fertility was so high. But within a short space of time, child mortality started to decline. Children's life expectancy they were more likely to survive. And around the same time, we had policies that promoted education, including the policies passed by the BNP government in the early 90s, secondary school stipend for girls. And this was hugely important. It went not only to government schools, but to the registered madrasas. And it meant that many more girls were now going to school. Many more women were being hired as teachers. So here was a set of changes. And if you try and examine from the bottom up what drove those changes, you will find that nobody had asked women what they felt about high fertility. Nobody had asked women about what toll it took on their bodies to be bearing one child after another. And what the family planning program offered them in the 80s was a range of different methods, plus female family planning workers coming to their home, allowing them to exercise some secrecy in whether they adopted family planning or not. And I came across groups of women who went secretly to get sterilized. Religious leaders might have been against it, but from the women's own point of view, and sometimes from their mother-in-law, and sometimes from the husband, they knew that high rates of fertility did not promise the same kind of prosperity that it had in the past. They could look around them and see that families with large numbers of children were not able to feed their families. Their land was shrinking. There was no wage labor left for them. And the issue of education, and also what we have to see is the way that organizations like BRAC, like ICDDRP, these organizations complemented and compensated for the weaknesses of bad governance. What the state could not do, these organizations were able to do. And because this was the 70s and 80s, and very soon after liberation, there was an idealism in the air about how you're going to build a new nation, and why you took poverty seriously, and why you took education seriously. So one part of the story is how change happened in terms of fertility, mortality, and education. Also, what was happening is a rise of female labor force participation, some of it driven by poverty. It was no longer possible for landless households to keep women at home not working. Women were looking for jobs wherever they could find it, even if it was as a domestic or whatever. But as the government started to adopt family planning, community health, education, more better jobs started to be available. And here you see the negotiations that took place for women with some education who did not want to work in the fields, who didn't want to work as a domestic, but who saw these government jobs and even the factory jobs as somehow more respectable, something that they could do. And so a lot of the negotiation that took place was women negotiating with husbands, with fathers. I have a lovely story of a young girl in the book I wrote in 1994 about the garment sector. Here's a young girl in a village, And she sees these young garment workers coming to their village, and they're all dressed very nicely, and they're all very smart. And she says to her father, I want to go work in the factory. And the father says, no, you can't. You'll be alone. You'll be corrupted. Can't happen. So she goes to her mother and says, please persuade my father. Mother says, no. Goes to her brother, please tell my father to let me go. And in the end, she promised to go and stay with her aunt in the town, but she went and worked in the factory, and she found a way to take some control over her life. And what is also interesting about what was happening now is these women were earning, but their earnings were embedded in a discourse of joint family welfare. I am earning to help my father. I am earning to get my daughter an education or my son an education. These were not phrased as, I am earning to become liberated. Absolutely not. In fact, one woman said to me in 1987, a smart woman never shows her power. She never shows her power. So we saw that, and along the way, these women who were, garment workers, you don't want to marry your son to a garment worker, but there was much more love marriages because they were meeting men in the factory floor. And love marriages meant you don't ask for dowry because you're doing it on your own. And what I've seen over time is that love marriages have also been increasing in Bangladesh. And with it, the meaning of dowry has also been changing, and I've talked about it in my book. So while family planning and fertility decline, which is often seen as the start of women's liberation, women did not adopt family planning for liberation. They adopted to have fewer children. They adopted to protect their own health. But it made possible opportunities, such as in the labor force, which they might not have been able to take up if they had large numbers of children. So all of these things, they speak to each other. They build on each other. They dovetail. They are not separate pieces of change. Then I was also struck by the fact that although we've had a rising, a weakening of commitments to secularism in the country, a rising commitment to Islamic forms of orthodoxy, to Wahhabism, to people coming from the Middle East with new ideas about what Islam means, and does Islam in Bangladesh, is it really Islam or is it a corrupted form of Islam? All of that is going on, but the Islamic parties never won votes. They never seem to win votes. And I think, again, it was quite interesting to then unpack what does lived Islam mean in Bangladesh? Not the Islam that is being imposed on you by people who think they know better, but the Islam that you practice, that you inherited from your parents, your grandmothers, etc. And actually, the lived Islam is far more flexible than the Orthodox Islam. And that's why this phrase, we follow Shariat, but we follow Marfati too. Whenever people seem to be doing something that goes against Orthodox Islam, they would say, but Marfati allows us to do this. Our own spiritual conscience allows us to do this. And I found that quite an interesting example of pragmatism in Bangladesh. And one of the reasons why very poor women did not want to vote for Islamic parties is they did not want the gains that they were making in the labor front and in education to be taken away from them. What the future holds, I don't know. But at least in the research that I read, we found a much more flexible. And we find this flexibility in particular when we look at women veiling. People assume that if you veil, that means you are pious. But actually, when we talk to women across the villages of Bangladesh, there are many different meanings attached to veiling. For some women, it is about piety. It is about being a virtuous, a good Muslim woman. For other women, it is about protection in the public domain, not to be harassed. For yet other women, it's very practical. I don't have to wear fresh clothes every day. I can just cover myself and go. For some women, it is about fashion. There's a whole industry about fashion hijab. Different colors, fitting, not fitting, etc. So we cannot ascribe the same set of meanings to what people do around the issue of veiling. And of course, veiling has always been a very important topic in the Bangladesh story. And the final chapter is asking, why did parents start to revalue daughters? Why are we seeing a decline in son preference? And why are we seeing a greater willingness to just have daughters, if that's what you have? or even to welcome daughters. And I think the reason is that with the way that globalization has affected Bangladesh, with the very, the paucity of jobs in the agricultural sector, the way that men in particular have had to move looking for jobs to the towns, to other villages across the world, the ties between parents and their sons has become weaker. It also means that sons are much more focused on their wives and their children than they are on their parents as compared to the past. But daughters don't go very far, right? Some daughters may migrate. When I was doing work in the garment industry in Bangladesh, 87, I asked a garment worker, why do you think the employers hire mainly women? And she said, it's because women are like a bird with a broken wing. We cannot fly very far. And for parents, they find, okay, daughters now have jobs. They're able to financially support parents even after they get married. But one interesting thing that was happening in this particular village and elsewhere is that mothers in particular wanted their daughters to be educated so that their daughters could stand up to their in-laws and insist on helping their parents. But they were very critical about daughters-in-law who were educated, who in turn stood up to them. So the same mother valued educating her daughter so she could stand up to her in-laws and, help her parents, but was very angry with daughters-in-law who were educated and were not giving them the respect that they had deserved. And so there's a section of the book where I talk about these mothers and fathers, and they say something which I never heard in the 1970s. They say, I want my daughter to be educated so that if she is abused, she can walk out of her marriage. In the 1970s, nobody ever said, I want my daughter to be able to walk out of her marriage. So, this is one particular village, but we're hearing these stories in different parts of Bangladesh. So going back to the idea of the paradox, let me just move on. Next. So if you like, the book tells three types of stories. One is the big picture story, history, geography, path dependence, syncretic religion, a pragmatic culture, different kinds of connectedness. One of the points that Naomi Hussain makes in her book is that after 71 is the first time in our history, for a very long time, that Bangladesh was ruled by people who came from Bangladesh. They came from the Mufassal towns and the villages of Bangladesh. And that meant they had a kind of empathy for the people of the country that perhaps the Mughals did not, perhaps the British did not, perhaps the Pakistanis did not. So we were connected in that way. We were connected because of density of population, ideas travel. We were connected through infrastructure, and we were connected through the absence of a caste system. Ideas could jump over hurdles. In the village where my grandfather was born, the guy who we called his kind of major domo, he was the guy in charge of the household, is today the richest man in the village. So a person could go from being a domestic servant to the richest man in that village within the space of a generation. And another part of the big picture story is all the different influences. Bangladesh is no longer a closed economy. It is open to, for better and for worse, to influences from the West, ideas about rights, ideas about sexuality, ideas about freedom, and influences from the Middle East, ideas about virtue, propriety, patriarchy, and so on. But all of these influences are there, and different groups of people adhere to them to a different extent. Next. The second part of the story is about women's agency. And there were two forces for change. One is poverty. Women had to do certain things. They had to break with the past because of sheer need and scarcity. But that meant if things changed, they would go back to what it was like. But women also changed their behavior because of new opportunities. The opportunities offered by microfinance, by garments, by migration, and so on. And opportunity creates more lasting change because you are taking up an opportunity not out of need because it promises something else. But there were forces of stability as well. Patriarchy was not overthrown. Women needed, girls, boys, mothers, etc., needed the security of family. So very few of them engaged in open defiance. Patriarchal risk in Bangladesh is to have no one to fall back on. And as a woman, the possibilities of having people to not to have people fall back on can be very dangerous. It opens you to harassment, it opens you to all kinds of. And of course, there are the power values. But what I think is very, very interesting, and I hope you read the book because it's the thing that fascinated me, is the motivating power of individual histories. Mothers talked about what it was like growing up as a disregarded daughter. They watched the way that sons were favored. They watched the way that, their future, just get them married off as soon as possible, their future did not matter. And so you hear these mothers saying, I want my daughter to have a better future. She must have education. She must have all the opportunities that she can. And then if one day she looks after me, that's good. And so I loved this quote. We begin to get a sense not only of the myriad adaptations, responses, reactions, and resistance to the way the world is, but also of individuals struggling to make the world a different place. And although these individuals didn't set out to make the world a different place, the Bangladesh of today is very different from the Bangladesh that I went and did my field work in. Next, please. And the final level of analysis is the middle level, the practices. And here what we're looking at is how things become a norm, how certain ideas and values get renegotiated in unintentional ways to become new norms. A young woman who was interviewed in 1990 said, today family planning is like dal bhat, right? But in the beginning, family planning was a break with cultural norms. Today, it is like dal bhat. And mother says, I send my daughter to school. Why do you send your daughter to school? Well, I don't know. Everybody's sending their daughter to school. This is how new norms start to become practice. I found the way that policies spoke to each other, the scale, the speed, and the synergies. Family planning, nutrition, education, all of these things worked synergistically and in turn made possible the taking advantage of new opportunities like work, like education, and so on. And I want to say one thing. I was astonished at how important the power of female education was, more so than male education. And because so many people are cynical about education, poor quality education. So speaking to you as a university, please take your vocation very, very seriously. There is half a page of my book with footnotes which challenges those people who say, it's not just female education, it's male education. It's actually half a page of quantitative results which tell you all the different ways in which female education mattered in the statistical data. And the final point is mechanisms of change. When we look at the social sciences, we hear about things like role models, right? We hear about tipping points. We hear about demonstration effects. We hear about, all feedback loops. All these different names are given to how change happens. But what I found very interesting and what I learned from my own findings is these mechanisms are driven by individuals, but individuals observing the world around them. So a rickshaw puller who used to take the children of a doctor to school every day, he said, when my daughters grow up, I want them to be like this woman. That's the role model. Somebody else said, I see in that household, they've educated their daughters. Those daughters are now earning and looking after their parents. And that's a demonstration effect. You find that in villages where you had Grameen Bank, many more women members adopted family planning, but so did non-members. And that was the spillover effect. So behind all of these different social science mechanisms of change are individuals and societies, individuals looking at societies around them. So finally, let me come to the end. Resolving the paradox? Well, some paradoxes can be resolved by showing that the premise was slightly false, that the inferences included unjustified steps, or that the conclusions turned out more plausible than initially thought. But I don't think we have a Bangladesh paradox. I think what Bangladesh did is what it had to do with what it had. It was surprising, perhaps, But it is only a paradox because it does not conform to the West's trajectory of development, to particular stages of economic growth, to particular ideas about what modernization will look like, to particular stages of demographic transition theory. Our story is the story of a people that inherited a particular culture, inherited a particular history, and then inherited a certain degree of pragmatism, and then were able to do what they could with what they had. There was nothing particularly paradoxical about them, and we need to rewrite the history of our countries so they're not judged by the extent to which they do or do not conform to Western ideas about growth, demographic transition, and so on. And so my final slide is, of course, the million-dollar question. Is this progress sustainable? Actually, what made it supposed to be a paradox has not changed as much as we might have thought, right? Yes, we have reduced poverty. Absolutely. We have very respectable rates of growth, though now we're being told maybe the government lied about our rates of growth, which makes our progress even more paradoxical. But along with the growth rates, we have seen a steady rise in inequality. So that some people remain extremely poor in this country, extremely poor. And wealth is concentrated at the top. We have seen a failure to generate jobs, decent jobs. The vast majority of jobs in Bangladesh are in the informal economy. We are having to migrate, export our labor with all the risks and dangers that it carries. But we have educated people, and aspirations have risen and frustrations have set in. Our track record on governance, and I don't have to let anyone else know this now, has remained poor, as evident from the July Revolution, and the consistent failure to tax the wealthy. We have one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world, means that very little of the benefits of growth trickle down to poor people. Bangladesh, we talk about the paradox of culture and Islam. Bangladesh has been one of the more tolerant Muslim countries in the world towards its minorities, according to the Peer Center. And in terms of its attitude to Ahmadiyyas, etc. It could, of course, be much better. But the country is now in a state of flux, and there are allegations being made about how we treat our minorities. We are full of hope. Can we fix this? But we are also full of trepidation. Will it be business as usual, but with a different gang in power, doing exactly what the old gangs did? Or do we have the opportunity to rewrite the course of our history? And in the end, what about the rights of women and minorities? These are closely tied up. Those who deny the rights of women are the same people who deny the rights of minorities. Those who deny the rights of women as being equal human beings are the same people who deny the rights of minorities as being equal human beings. And I know that not all political forces in the country at the moment are equally committed to the idea of equality, of unconditional equality. So my question is this book, and your review said it's very timely, is this book a last chapter in a story of progress? Or does it mark the beginning of a new and a far more democratic story? And we won't know the answer for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kabeer. This was really, really exciting. Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing the screen. I am trying to. Did I stop sharing yet? Yes.
No.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, done. Thank you so much. This was really insightful, really fascinating. I took many notes, which probably made me slightly 2 seconds late as I was changing slides. But I am grateful for the conversation. The floor is now open for questions. A couple of rules about questions. Please keep your questions short, to the point, and kindly do not simply comment, but ask and engage. This is particularly true for our coworkers and colleagues and faculty members. We would love to hear from you. As for our students who are part of the conversation, may I request you to kindly ask your questions in the chat box. Once again, short to the point questions would be great. I would pick it up and throw it to Professor Kabeer soon. But for now, colleagues, does anybody have any questions? Dr. Rizwan.
Thank you, Professor Kabeer, once again for an excellent talk. I just was wondering that the example that you gave in your book, village which I understand is a traditional village. So what about indigenous people? And secondly, as you have rightly mentioned, that at least on this front, our progress has been substantially better than what is the case with India or Pakistan. So could you share some thought on that? That how our case is different from their case, although I know that's not the focus of your book, but if you have any thoughts on that, and also any thought on the indigenous community. Thank you.
Okay. Do you mind if I just take the questions, and I'll be very brief myself? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, let's take a few together. Yeah.
No, I'd like to take them as they
just
come.
this?
Yes.
Sure, please do.
Because,
Please
so
do.
on the indigenous peoples, I make a point in the very first chapter that no book covers everything. I was interested in how did people who had been left behind, how did they make progress? The literature I've read on indigenous peoples, on Chakmas, etc., have been, we have statistics on them being left behind, excluded from progress. We have literature on the attitudes of the Bengali majority towards indigenous people. But we don't have the kind of field work that would allow me to weave them into the story. So the introduction says very, very clearly, there is very little attention. Every now and again, I give you a statistic, but there's very little. Hindus also. I don't name people as Hindus unless I have to, right? If someone says something and what they're saying reflects their religion, I see this was a Hindu woman. Otherwise, I just treat them as, people just talking, okay? The comparison, and there is a study being done that looks beyond India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, that looks at Bangladesh as an outlier internationally, and the extent to which it has performed better than other countries, including India and Pakistan, other countries at similar or higher levels of income. But focusing on India and Pakistan, I would say there are 2 or 3 things. One is our history that kept us isolated from the mainstream of India, from caste, from all of that. Pakistan is a very feudal society. Our feudalism was mainly Hindu zamindars, and after they left, we had a lot of rich farmers, but they didn't have that God-given right to rule. Caste never took down deep roots. Our culture is an interestingly pragmatic one, in a way that a caste system does not. So in India, we're seeing the very rigid patriarchal practices of the North moving to the South, rather than the progressive aspects of the South coming to the North. So the Brahmanical culture has been a very powerful force blocking progress. Do you know a statistic which I haven't shown? I think in 2011, 70% of Indians practiced, in the survey, practiced open defecation. Bangladesh, it was 17%. Today, I think in Bangladesh, open defecation is 5%. It is still 25, 30%, in spite of Modi's interest in building toilets. Why? Because the whole caste system around, cleaning, the system around, who cleans your toilets, these toilets in the countryside, sanitary latrines. There's something very off about the way in which caste blocks opportunity. And feudalism in Pakistan, I think, had the same. And Pakistan, of course, was a part of that regional belt, very linked to, Western Asia. I know we have a saying in Bangladesh, which is often cited, that, today I'm a jhola. Tomorrow, if I'm lucky, I will be a sheikh. And day after tomorrow, if the rains are good, I will be a sayyid. Now, that man in my grandfather's village, he became a sayyid. He didn't become a sayyid, he was a mandol. But, within the space of a generation, he could rise. People reinvent themselves. One other example, 1872, the first census carried out by the British, is when we found out what percentage of the population of the Eastern Delta were Muslim. Everybody thought they were Hindu because, after all, Bengal was Hindu. 1872, 80%, 70% of Eastern Bengal declared itself Muslim. but they kept their caste names. So they had Hindu caste names. In 1902, the next census, the majority of these Muslims had all become sheikhs. They dropped their caste names and they became sheikhs. Now, this is not an option that is easily available in a village structure which is very heavily dominated by caste. So, and also when, Monica Dasgupta, etc., look at Eastern Asia, they also talk about the rigidities of beliefs. So I would say that in Bangladesh, religion and culture spoke together. It wasn't that religion or religious beliefs that dominated everything. We had a folk culture. And so what is my single story is greater flexibility and greater pragmatism. We lived at the edge of disaster all the time, and we had to find ways of survival. So I think it's made us individualistic, but it's also made us ingenuous, finding ways of out of problems. That's it.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Anyone else from our colleagues? Norm?
If I may, good day, Doctor. This is Norm Swazo. I have a question in relation to your comment about the number of love marriages increasing in Bangladesh. And I draw a contrast between the woman who happens to be going to a university, not married, but the village girl who finishes SSC and then gets into an arranged marriage and then loses her opportunity for growth, such as saying, well, I want to go to the next level of HSC. The husband, who is lesser educated, says no, and she now remains doing whatever the household chores are and so on and so forth. And so it seems to me there may be a contrast between the love marriage woman and the arranged marriage woman, and the latter one, in fact, does not have the opportunity to negotiate patriarchy. Patriarchy remains in place. Would you agree with that, or have some comment on it?
No, I wouldn't agree. First of all, this thing about love marriages, they first started appearing in my research with the garment factories, right? Nobody wanted to marry garment workers, but they married each other, and then dowry, etc. But I have seen, and it is not just in my own findings elsewhere, there is a rise. And a colleague of mine from LSC went and did some work in a village in rural areas in Bangladesh, and she talked about this idea of the wrong number relationships. Mobile phones allow young men and women to communicate with each other, to date, to meet, etc., outside the purview of parents, okay? So some of these turn into love marriages. Sometimes you find that the boy has been lying or the girl has been lying. They're not as beautiful or as rich or anything. But there is much more scope. What I also find interesting in my village is the extent to which older people, older women, missed the kinds of conversations that take place between younger couples. They felt that they were denied that companionship that they see amongst younger people. So why I go back to your point about the arranged marriage, about the love marriage, is that, and this is work by Sajida Amin et al., is that there are two things that are happening in Bangladesh that are interesting. One is what is called education hypergamy. In other words, you are now more willing to marry your daughter to someone who's less educated than her, because you pay less dowry, right? But the other is daughters are also being allowed, not everywhere, but daughters are also being allowed to continue education after marriage. So those daughters whose education chances are shut off by marriage fall into the category you're talking about. But according to Sajida Amin and other demographers, there is much more acceptance amongst in-laws that their daughter-in-law may continue in education afterwards. So I think the picture is a little bit more fuzzy than the kind of dichotomy that you're suggesting.
Thank you.
May I? Yeah,
Please.
okay. Thank you, Professor Kabeer. This is Dr. Zaina Shabnaz Akas. I'm serving as assistant professor at the Department of History and Philosophy. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and it was really enjoyable indeed. My question about gender inequality. I think that like you, I also did my PhD field research on Faridpur, named the North Channel Chor, and I did very careful and close study with the local women as well. And even I found that these women, they have a very sharp mind, critical and analytical capacity. And even some of these women, they made the truly astonishing statement. So the thing is that if we talk about, like, yes, of course, due to lot of development programs like through the microcredit, Reflect, or other program, these women, they become very participating or involve themselves in this regard. But still, we believe that to change the women's status, that is the inseparable from the process of overcoming the existing social hierarchies, because they believe that they lived in a society and that should be considered if someone want to, I mean, change them and so on, right? So my question is that if in terms of inequality, what would be the possible ways from your perspective to overcome such gender equality? Because still we are saying that they are facing this kind of discrimination in their society, and they believe that this is their society and they have to follow, even though they are receiving a lot of opportunities and so on, but they must follow the society they live in with. So what would be the possible strategies or policies that should be overcoming for the gender inequality? Thank you so much.
You know, the title of this book was very carefully chosen. And it never said this is a book about overthrowing patriarchy, right? And actually, I don't know which society has seen a sudden move from highly patriarchal to non-patriarchal. We are on a road to progress, hopefully to progress. But that road and that journey must be at the pace of the people who are undertaking it and who stand to lose the most if things go wrong. So I don't know about the people that you're talking to. I know, and I've been working with the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development team members over the years. I am struck by the canniness of the women that I talk to. And there are many that completely abide by the norms of their society, and that is their prerogative. There are many that are impatient, but realize that, they have to carry others with them. So all I can say is that we have to continue to take seriously all policies, all programs that have at their heart of them the idea of the equality of all human beings. Men, women, religious, everything. That struggle is a unified struggle. And I think if we never compromise on that principle of equality, other things will follow. But I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I don't know what levels of domestic violence continue. I don't know. I know that sexual harassment remains a huge problem in Bangladesh, a huge problem. These things have not gone away. But I think if there is a story, if there is a lesson that comes out of this book at all, people are always asking, what is the policy lesson? The policy lesson is you have to take the pace of change. You have to bring about change at the pace that doesn't penalize some of the most, vulnerable or the most marginalized people. It is often the most privileged that hang on to these norms because they can afford to hang on to the norms. They like the status that goes on with the norms. So it is for those people who find these norms unaffordable, who may not even buy into the values that are being promoted by these norms. They're the ones with a stake of change, a stake in change for the future. And I think there is no one can give you an answer to your question. They can only give you broad advice.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
If I may take the opportunity to engage a little. There's several things I enjoyed and found beneficial from today's conversation. For me, two stand out. One that has already been mentioned, the fact that this is not about overthrowing, but it's about renegotiating what patriarchy is, which is such an important, fundamentally feminist intervention that still needs to happen, not just at the policy level, but at the level of understanding what the feminist relationship with patriarchy is. Because too often it is seen as too broad, generalized attempt to dethrone men, as though patriarchy and men are equally synonymous subject matters in this discourse. So for me, that was really significant. The second thing I think came at the very end of your talk, where you talked about the paradox not being a paradox. They're not being a paradox at all, because Bangladesh is only seen as a paradox when it is seen through the lens of the very westernized Euro-American construct of modernity and advancement, or even what progress looks like for women, what agency looks like for women. Following that observation, I suppose my question is about how do you, as a scholar of gender and economics, view the emancipatory interpretation of garments workers' participation in economic and public life, while it is almost always characterized by violent exploitation at the hands of the garment factory owners? How do we negotiate? And once again, that word comes out again. How do we negotiate the dual reality that, yes, it has empowered women in significant ways, and yet it continues to disenfranchise and exploit and at the same time marginalize them? And that remains a ground reality. So I suppose that's a question I would like to know your thoughts on.
Sure. I want to pick up a couple of things. One is this business about the future, right? And I think a phrase I use again and again in the book is there are alternative pathways to personhood, right? So Islam, or Orthodox Islam, has one pathway, but we must allow the fact that there are many different kinds of Islams and many different religions, alternative pathways, and that pluralism is essential if we are to be a civilized nation. The other is also patriarchy and men. One of the things I think I found myself at odds with some of my feminist colleagues in Britain is they thought that women giving their loans to men was, somehow kind of deferring to patriarchy.
Yes.
What they didn't understand was the shared solidarity of class. Women are not only women, they are members of class, indigenous, and other groups. And a lot of these women saw their husbands being, oppressed by landlords, extorted by moneylenders. And they said, why would I want to keep this money for myself if I can see that my husband, who is trying to earn money for the rest of the family, is suffering? So the shared solidarities that people experience, because they are not one-dimensional identities, is something that's very important. Men still exercise a lot of privilege in Bangladesh. But with that privilege, there are certain costs, and we are not aware, or we are not attuned enough to what the costs of being the male breadwinner and being responsible is. And I think that is something we need to factor in much more. But then to your question about the garment workers, of course, I've been working for a very long time with the garment industry. And I have been one of those people that said, don't just treat them as victims, right? They are people who have made decisions and fought hard to get into the factories. It is something about the mindset of elites in Bangladesh. As much as they might come from, the same backgrounds, etc., that individualism that does not allow them to see garment factories as a shared enterprise where workers' labor, their capital, their contacts are helping to make profits. But beyond them are the buyers. And it has been extraordinary, the double standards that I see in this place, in this industry, all the time talking about labor standards, all the time, even, and we've written an article about post-Rana Plaza, the Accord Alliance agreements, all the time that they were asking factories to get, health and safety sorted out, the expenses were undertaken by the factories. The prices that they gave the factory owners went down and down. The lead time went down and down. So this is hypocrisy. Yet it's double standards. Yet the workers never saw beyond the factory owner. they were not that aware that that factory owner was being screwed by delivery times, by prices. So when we start to condemn Bangladesh factory owners, and we should, and they have done very, very well, thank you very much, with all the privileges they've been given by government after government, who chose not to diversify our industrial base, but to put all our eggs in one basket. When we condemn them, we should not forget that behind the factory owners are even more powerful players whose only interest in Bangladeshi workers is how cheaply they can produce fast fashion. Now, that future of the garment industry may be up in a question mark because of climate change, because of the heat, because of moving away from fast fashion towards more conservative ways. But it doesn't take away that fundamental reality that exploitation doesn't just happen within the national boundaries. It happens all the way along the garment value chain. How do we change it? Organizing, by organizing.
Thank you. That was really great. I read that piece that you were talking about, and I remember thinking that we still need to think through the garments question beyond the parameters of Bangladesh, because we tend to think that it's a two-dimensional equation stuck within the nation state, but it's much larger than that. I'm going to take two questions from our students who've posted in the comment section. One is from Shaheen. She wants to know, how do we initiate conversations with male family members about women-centric issues? This is about our lived experience, truly. Second is, how do we move forward towards greater gender equality while respecting cultural and societal dynamics, as you talk about in your book, that is the renegotiating, that is what it is all about. For example, some parents feel threatened to even provide cell phones to daughters in the 10th grade, while it is completely fine for boys to do whatever they wish after they're being born. I think the two questions speak to our lived reality, and as we attempt to negotiate our relationship with patriarchy in our day-to-day life. Your thoughts on that would be greatly appreciated.
Well, these are not easy questions. But on this business of conversations, I'm going to give you a little anecdote from my own family. So I had a very nice uncle. He was a very liberal man, and he set up a foundation called the AFMR Mujibur Rahman Foundation in Dhaka, which promotes excellence in mathematics. One day he decided to do a family tree, right? Now, we don't have a written culture. So he went back many generations, and I don't know where he got that information from, but there we were, several generations ago, this person begat so-and-so, this person begat so-and-so, this person begat so-and-so, etc., right down to us. But the women were missing. This was a family tree of only men. And I said to him, Bablu Mama, where's my mother? Where's your mother? Where's their mother? And he said, oh, well, family trees, you know. But it hit home. And he went back and he redid the family tree, and he put where he could the names of the women. And I said to him, do you know what it feels like to be completely invisible from the history of your family? When your mother was a widowed at the age of 47, brought up 9 children on her own, and you don't even bother to put her there. So that was a slightly aggressive conversation. But I think with all our male relatives and so on, I think the conversation should be, imagine for 1 minute that you were given the treatment that you expect me to accept. Imagine for 1 minute that you got on the bus and someone touches you up and gropes you. Imagine for 1 minute that you've got your hand up to ask a question and you're being ignored time and time again because it's the men who are seen. Try and put yourself in the place that I have to occupy. I think that is the conversation one had, because you can't fight with them, right? You don't want to fight with them. You want to appeal to a sense of justice. And you want to appeal to an empathy. So one of the things that I found in the work that I did with Nijera Kori in Bangladesh is one man who they were fighting around land, and it was physical fights, confrontations. And he said, my wife fought along with me, And I suddenly looked at her and I suddenly realized that here is a woman who every day does this and that, who is willing to risk her life alongside me. And I have never, ever noticed it, you know. So I don't know how you have these ordinary conversations, but I think at some place, it is about what is so difficult or so controversial about wanting to be treated equally. Why is that such a big ask, right? So I think those are conversations. The one thing and I don't practice what I preach, is not to lose one's temper. You know, and I can't say that I practice what I preach, you know, because you just listen to people and say, oh, well, it's always been like this, etc. No, it's not, etc. But yes, you have to have that conversation, and you have to appeal to your parents as well. You know, parents can be very important arbiters in all of this. Not all parents are wonderful. So I would say that. And it's the same thing about respecting cultural and societal dynamics. One thing we should recognize is culture today in Bangladesh is not culture in Bangladesh in 1971. Culture is not static. We are all, you know, now I see almost every second woman in Bangladesh is wearing covered. That didn't used to be the case. That's not our culture. That is a culture that has come in and we have adopted it. Fine, no problem. But don't say that we are respecting our culture, because you go through the photographs and images of Bangladesh through the centuries and women did not dress like that. So culture is always changing, either more restrictively or more progressively. And, you know, if parents, that young girl who fought with her father to go to the fire, she said, you have to trust me. She told her father, you have to trust me. And these girls who are being denied phones, you have to trust them. But you can understand why parents are wary, because they worry about what will happen to a girl and a wrong number of relationships and all that. So it isn't parents all by themselves being unreasonable. Parents are reacting to the way that society reacts to a girl who somehow steps out of line. So, yeah, it's something that, but what we also need to recognize is I look back today, I look back on the choices my grandmother had. I look back on the choices my mother had, and I look back on the choices I have today, and the world has changed. You know, my grandmother had she had 14 children, 9 survived. She had 3 daughters and 6 sons. And when people asked her, how many children do you have? She would say, I have 6 precious diamonds. She never mentioned her daughters, but never mentioned her daughters. My mother grew up with such a sense of rage about that one thing she communicated to me is never underestimate yourself. You know, others may underestimate you, but never underestimate yourself. So I think, you know, for the people who are asking these questions, they need to recognize that going against the grain takes courage. And you can minimize the cost for yourself if you do it in a diplomatic way, in a less confrontational way. And I think that is the lesson that this book is about.
Thank you, Professor Kabeer. I think the continuum of agency that you speak of, 2 of them would be hugely influential for us here: hidden resistance and bargaining. Let's give a little to gain a little.
Yes,
I think that's the answer that we're looking for. It's 8:54. I think we are doing great in terms of time. I would officially like to conclude today's webinar. I would like to thank Professor Kabeer for her time, for sharing her wisdom, and for sharing her research with us. We learned a lot. I personally felt that I decided to have an even deeper conversation with myself as a feminist thinker in terms of how such negotiations not only impact the ways in which our individual lived experiences alter and reshape around ourselves, but also how those structural changes came to be. That as much as our stories are individual, they're tied to larger social, geographic, economic realities. And they are not just rooted in Bangladesh. They tell a much bigger story about the region, about the globe, about the relationship we have with the global north. I'm very grateful for your time. And I'm particularly grateful to Dean Rizwan for his interest in letting this webinar happen. And I am grateful that everybody who showed up here and asked questions, asked such poignant, important, crucial questions. Dr. Kabeer.
Can I just say one thing?
Please.
As you know, this book is open access and you can download it for free. However, I found when I came to Bangladesh this time, a lot of people in Bangladesh don't like this idea of open access. They want the physical book. They want the book. Now, you can order it from Amazon. Right. However, we are talking to University Press in Dhaka, and I'm really hoping that we do get a Bangladesh edition of the book or a South Asia edition.
Please let me know when that happens.
And I will tell everyone, please read the book, because actually it is a labor of love.
Yes.
And it's a labor of love for the people of Bangladesh. So
thank you. Thank you, Professor Kabeer. Please download the book. The link is there somewhere in the chat. It's a really good read, honestly. If you care a little bit about Bangladesh and what we're going through, you would enjoy it. And I hope that the deal with UPL goes through. Any final thoughts before we close for the evening?
No, but thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Thank you, Professor Kabeer. Thank you, colleagues and students. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, students. Have a good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.